Hello, 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 and welcome to the Blue Oval Podcast. I am Ben Weissel, and joining me, as always, Garrett Zatlin. How's it going, man?
Ben, it wasn't going great earlier this week. I came
For
down.
any of us, I don't think
No,
it was going
really,
very well.
no. You obviously your son was ill. My roommate was ill. My roommate's girlfriend was ill. Then I was like, well, certainly I will not get ill, and I did, and I'm still recovering from that. But we're rallying. We're warriors. We're right here because that's what we do. Saturday afternoon, doing the podcast, and we were glad to have you back, and glad everything's going well on your end.
I'm glad to be back. Yeah, sorry to miss out on going through those indoor rankings. I think this was a tough group to rank. I
Yeah.
felt like that podcast could have been really, really long because the amount of guys like you have some big newcomers like Haptim Samuel that are in there that's hard to be able to decipher, and there doesn't seem to be like that huge favorite in really any event, and I think that always makes it really hard to decipher those rankings.
Because you don't directly work with the women's rankings, I
Mhm.
won't ask you about them. But if you had to sit back and self-reflect, obviously, you look back, you gave some input
Sure.
on the orders, and really, actually, that's where we mainly made all of our changes to it. What would you, upon reflection, grade our men's rankings? Because we're so directly involved.
Yeah, I would say they're like an A minus. Like I don't know if we could. I think we did as well as we could have. I think it was one of those tests where it's like it's needed to be graded on a curve because no one got an A. Like I honestly feel like that's how it was. And on the women's side, there is some interesting stuff. Obviously, you have Volby, who's a little bit of a huge favorite in her event, but then you have someone like Markovic. You have just a host of like milers that are going to be super interesting. You
Hmm.
have that trio of 800-meter runners. How do you like incorporate them? Like you have a great new 800-meter freshman. There's just a lot of different things going on the women's side as well that made that really, really interesting.
Yeah, the initial orders that I had with Mara and Finn were so all over the place. I mean, we were not on par at all. But regardless, we made it here. You know who is I think like all in agreement and all on the same page is our TSR Blue Oval podcast listeners. They got a new Apple review and rating. We got +1 there with a review that says they dig into high school and college mid and distance running. Nice interchange between the hosts, good coverage across XC and college signing areas. Thank you. Really, really appreciate that. Even that was above and beyond what we ever need, and I still really appreciate that. We're up to 82 on Apple, and then we were already at 141
Okay.
on Spotify last week, but regardless, 141 is a good number, and we'll take that. Thank you to everyone who's doing that. Let's continue our climb, and yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Well, let's dig into our big topic for the podcast. And as Garrett said, we're recording this Saturday afternoon, which I don't think is super. I don't think this is going to change considering Christmas and
No,
everything.
no, it's
But
not.
just
No.
wanted to point that out there in case something wild happens. Florida State is suing the ACC in order to be able to leave the conference. Essentially, the Florida State University is trying to do is say that ACC's grant of rights, which is essentially the Florida State handing over their TV rights to the conference so that the conference can negotiate a overall television deal. Um, they are suing that to try to get out of that essentially. And there are harsh, harsh penalties for trying to leave this conference. Florida State, I think, is estimating that the overall cost to leave the conference with the exit fee, getting out of that TV rights deal, I think is about like 572 million, I think is what they
This is
estimate.
also, I think, like media revenue, like lost
Yes.
revenue, things of
Right.
that nature. So that it's they
It's
threw that number around.
number.
It's a misleading number, but
Yes.
it's an accurate number because but the whole thing of if they leave is that they'll join somewhere else and get revenue there. So it's a
Yes.
little misleading, but regardless, yes, still a lot of money.
Yeah. So they're essentially trying to go the litigation route for this because they have not been able to come to an agreement with the ACC to try to exit without paying those really high exit fees. And for the ACC, they feel like they're under no obligation. Florida State has signed this grant of rights twice, I believe. And the big contention here is their TV deal goes until 2036, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not, by that time, that TV deal is likely to be very undervalued for the ACC and for Florida State particularly. So they want to go try to find a different conference, whether it's the Big Ten, the SEC, or I've even seen some thoughts that if those two don't work out, they could end up in the Big 12. Which would be really interesting, where they can have a more competitive TV deal where they feel like they're being valued more financially. All this to say, there's going to be some kind of break, it seems like, between the ACC and Florida State. How that gets resolved is still to be decided. You read all these articles, and all these legal experts are basically like, we don't know what's going to happen. This has never been challenged before. This is something that we have really no good precedent for. So this, I mean, and even after a decision is made, if this goes to trial, it can be appealed and appealed. And this could just go on forever unless they come to some kind of settlement, some kind of agreement, which is, I would imagine, where we're headed. With that as a backdrop and as a summary, what are your first thoughts on this?
I think we are wildly underestimating how impactful it was that Florida State football got left out of the college football playoff. Yeah. If they get into the college football playoff, and for those who are not football fans, college football, Florida State football, very good this year. They went undefeated in a Power 5 conference, ACC, and in almost every year, that team is getting into the college
every year.
In every year, that team is getting into the playoffs, a 14 playoff. Excuse me, I'm still recovering. Anyways, that team is getting into the playoff. However, not Florida State. They lost Jordan Travis, I believe. Yeah, their quarterback late in the season, and the committee said, these are two separate teams, and we don't feel like it's a good schedule, but it's not quite as good as maybe a team that has one loss. We're not going to let you in. And Florida State was left out. People rioted. I mean, it was almost a shocking decision by the college football playoff. And I told my roommate, I don't think this is going to end pretty. Because, well, what do you mean? I go, well, Florida State is already looking to get out. I mean, we had this conversation earlier, you know, about how them, and I believe Clemson and UNC were kind of like already knocking like, hey, we might be trying to get to the SEC. And then when they didn't get in there, largely because, and yes, you can argue the quarterback situation, but probably because it was also their schedule was really good, but not amazing. And I told him, I think we're going to have a moment where this gets way uglier before it gets cleaner. And sure enough, that's what we're seeing.
There is some reporting that has said that FSU was looking for a way out and we're planning on doing this in 2024, but that that college football playoff snub basically accelerated it, where the board was just like, all right, enough's enough. We're not waiting. We're going now. And I don't know how much of a difference that makes in terms of like the timing, like it happening in December of 2023 versus July of 2024, how big of a difference those 6 or 7 months would be. But like you said, I think that was such an accelerator. And for a conference that has been on the downturn, at least in football, and as all these other conferences are gearing up, ACC tried to kind of do that same thing with adding a few of the Pac-12 schools as well. It's hard to see how they can recover if Florida State leaves. And for Florida State, I think they think they're going to be like the belle of the ball when it comes to other conferences trying to get them. But there really aren't a whole lot of indications that like the Big Ten or SEC are pushing that hard for them, which I think is also kind of an interesting subplot in all of this.
Well, I imagine you don't want to seem too eager,
Right.
right? Because then it becomes some financial deals, and it's like, well, really, you want us that bad? Well, how about you help us with our exit fee? And I imagine that. But you mentioned earlier how there's not really a precedent, and you're right. There's not certainly not to this magnitude. There was an argument about Maryland leaving back in 2012 for the
Right.
Big Ten. It's not really all that similar, but it is kind of a similar in terms of them arguing with trying to get out and what the exit fee should or shouldn't be. And here's my thing with Florida State. They're arguing, well, this is basically not fair. It's not applicable trade or whatever the language that they were using. They're like, this is restricting, and they failed to capitalize on opportunities. I go, really? Where? like just because you're falling behind in revenue to the Big Ten and to the SEC does not mean that the ACC has necessarily done a bad job. Also, why are you saying that it's an unfair exit fee now when you've had these years to do it? And yes, they've been knocking on the door. They've been whispering like how they haven't really loved this, but you signed it. I don't understand this, and it's like, where do you think that this is not going to be legally upheld? And here's the one thing that I think we should all be very careful about: if this is legally upheld, I'm sorry, if it's not legally upheld, excuse me, and Florida State leaves, that opens the door for everyone else to leave. You're looking at Clemson, UNC. I'm sure Virginia. There's been others from, probably Virginia. I don't know. I'm a Virginia Tech guy, so
Miami even.
Miami would be the big one.
And you bringing up Maryland is a great point, because I believe Florida State signed an additional agreement after Maryland left, because the ACC was trying to tie all those teams down more. So the fact that happened, they've signed several of these grant of rights over the course of the last 15 years. And so I think it's like you said, it really opens Pandora's box in terms of just making all of these seemingly very legal good contracts void. And that just doesn't seem like something that I would imagine any judge is going to want to do. So and that's why at the end of the day, I don't think this ends in trial. I think this ends in some kind of settlement, because I don't think the ACC is necessarily going to want an unhappy partner who's suing them. And Florida State is going to be willing to pay some money to be able to get out and get its way. But the ACC also has to be very careful about that agreement, because you don't want to open Pandora's box by just, if you're unhappy enough, you can leave. There's a reason why there's these contracts. And I will say, to your point about why is Florida State unhappy with how the ACC has navigated their revenues, I think, like you said, ACC is not as valuable of a property as Big Ten or SEC, so they shouldn't be making as much. And so if they think they should, they're a little delusional. But I will say, the fact that the ACC locked themselves up for as long as they did with this TV deal, I think was a huge misstep in terms of allowing some of these teams to get very frustrated. On the other hand, the Pac-12 did not negotiate a long enough one.
That was my point. Isn't that why?
And they basically disintegrated. So for the ACC's overall health, I think it was advantageous that they did a longer deal. But on the other hand, that length is almost going to lose them their biggest fish.
Yeah, it's going to effectively, it doesn't allow them to keep up with the revenue of the Big Ten and of the SEC. They'll have to be playing significant catch up by 2036 if that is the case, and that does expire. And I don't know why ESPN would ever re-up.
Yeah, I think they can opt out in 2027, which I think is interesting if Florida State's gone, if ESPN would try to get out of that. But I mean, it's probably still a below market deal, and they'd probably still want to keep it.
Yeah, especially because you're looking at what the Big 12 is getting, and it's like
Yeah.
it's really not that far off. It's not. So when I'm taking a looking at this, and I'm like, man, like where does this actually happen? If it does happen, then I don't see the ACC crumbling
No,
because
there's too many schools
and that's it. There's too many schools, and if they were all to like leave, then like
where they go.
there's no way the Big Ten and SEC would never want to share that revenue. The Big 12 is already sharing way too much of their revenue to begin
Yep.
with. Um, I just don't see it happening. Now, would it be an exciting conference? Not really, but for cross country, I
Still
mean,
be great.
so we really
I
good.
mean, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Like from a football lens, it would certainly be deteriorate the conference, but from almost every other sport, it doesn't really matter if Florida State is there or not. Like, I mean, basketball still got plenty of great powerhouses in the ACC, and you look at track and cross country, obviously the sports that we follow, like they're going to be just fine. Florida State's great, but there's a lot of other good schools within the ACC. Really, all we're talking about here, and again, this is where the money comes from, is football.
Right. But football, at the end of the day, affects every other
Yeah.
sport. And that's what we're seeing with the transfer portal now, in terms of some of the limitations and those being pulled. It all really comes down to football. No one's like, you know what? The root of the problem is that cross country transfers can't compete in the next year if they don't hit this window. Like that's not what's happening, unfortunately. But yeah, isn't it wild? Like I was listening back to some of our other podcasts and specifically about the conference realignment from earlier this year. And you don't realize how fast some of this stuff can happen. And then all of a sudden, in an instant, it flips. And I would be very, very interested. Let's say, by the way, that Florida State, UNC, Miami, and Clemson,
Mm-hmm.
let's say they leave. Who are the schools that could replace them?
I was trying to think of where those schools would go because I honestly don't know if the Big Ten and SEC would take all of them. Hmm, trying to think of replacements. Maybe it's like a UCF, a some American
Well, I think
athletic, maybe
UCF
Memphis.
just joined the Big 12.
Oh right, yeah, you're right. You're completely right. Um, man, I don't know. They're I mean, as funny as it would be, Washington State and Oregon State could come on down and join their old Pac-12
I
brethren.
mean, they might have to. Like you could look at like Tulane maybe out of the AAC
Yeah.
or ECU. Maybe if you pick away from the Big East like UConn or Butler or Villanova or
Yeah, but those
Creighton.
you like those teams don't have FBS football teams.
They don't have
The
FBS, no,
yeah.
but and I so I wonder what the transition there. Like
Yeah.
Villanova has football, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think yeah, UConn
Butler
does as
does as
well.
well and UConn. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so they have football teams. Just a matter of like I don't know what the technicalities are of moving from
Yeah.
FBS to FCS. Um, but like the pickings are slim. Like there's really not a whole lot of options, especially in the Midwest and East Coast. You just kind of
I
shrug your
mean, because
shoulders and
the
like, eh.
yeah, because the Big 12 has gobbled up a lot of teams. I mean, obviously, the Big 10 and SEC are huge at this point. I mean, again, like I just don't see many other schools wanting to leave because I don't think there's a huge appetite for those other three conferences to expand further. Like unless they're going to have a huge amount of like revenue gain or it's a huge fish like Florida State, I just don't think there's a huge appetite for that. And I think we are getting to the point. I think Chip Kelly, UCLA's football coach, has mentioned this, where we might be getting to a point where football is its own kind of thing, like where you just have like its own like 64 team like league essentially for the FBS, and then all the other conferences or all the other sports operate on basically a normal conference level. I honestly don't hate that idea because I don't love the idea of all these other sports like cross country or track, like where there's not as much as like flying back and forth for like specific games or meets. you can kind of pick and choose depending on whatever. It doesn't really matter what conference you're in. But for like sports like soccer or volleyball, where you're flying halfway across the country to
It's
play a conference
ridiculous.
opponent, is stupid.
Like, how are
And
you
so
supposed to go to school?
I have no idea. Like you're spending effectively like 10 hours on a plane, like to go there and back. Like, what are you doing? Like, how does that
Makes
make
no
sense
sense.
financially or like just from a academic and mental health well-being of these student athletes?
Well, cross country is the one sport that really doesn't have to
Yeah, that's
worry
the
about
thing.
that.
Cross country and track, it's kind of like, whatever. Like, and so I'm making this argument on the wrong podcast, but I do think there is a scenario where we wake up in 2027, 2028, and football has its own deal, and all the other sports just go back to the normal conference model.
Well, until that happens, I'm going to happily enjoy the conferences that we do have, and I'm going to enjoy the multi-conference transfers that we're going to talk about next year. We're already at what, 23, 24 minutes here on the podcast, so I'm not gonna I'm not gonna keep us too long with some of these transfers, but three big ones, or at least three sets of big name transfers who I want to talk about before we get out of here today. That and the first one, I guess we'll start with, is Victor Kibiego, UTEP to Texas A&M. Scale of 1 to 10, surprise factor.
When I first heard it, I think I was pretty high. I was like a 7 or 8. But the more I've thought about it, I think I'm down to about a 5. From on its face, like he's not going to a big cross country power where they're really going to be able to utilize his cross country abilities. I think as much as maybe some others. Although, I mean, Texas A&M has been a solid cross country team, a little bit on the fringes of national qualifying in that South Central region. But when you think about the the geography of this, he's going to be just moving across the state in Texas, probably going to be able to be like stay familiar with all of that and be comfortable. And the second and more important point is he's going to be a huge point getter for a program that wants to challenge for national titles in the track, at least during the outdoor season. He's going to score a lot of points in the steeplechase, and it will do so for the next few years, which I think is particularly valuable for Texas A&M. So, on its face, very surprising. When I looked into it a little bit further, it's just, I think, a mild surprise.
I think it's even less surprising when you remember that his former coach at UTEP, Paul Earring, is now
Right?
the middle
Yeah.
distance coach at Texas A&M. Now, I don't know how they would train together. I don't even anticipate that they will, just because Kibiego is such a more aerobic based runner. But you're right. I mean, this is a track based program. They're going for national titles indoors and outdoors, right? So to get someone who can do the steeplechase and who, if Kenneth Rooks goes pro, which is very possible,
Hmm.
this guy's going to give them potentially 10 points. And I
Yep.
think he'd be favored to do so. He's got a lot of eligibility. And yeah, you're right. He does help them in cross country. And you can't help but wonder, I'm like, what if Texas A&M looks at this and goes, just, you know what? You know how we usually use this one scholarship on like a sprinter? Go use it on another distance guy. Because if they did that, and they have a pretty young team from last year that'll be a good bit older this year, they won't be amazing, but they'll have a shot to be interesting.
Yeah.
And the national qualifying conversation will certainly be there for them, and I think it's even a little bit there for them now. I still think they need a little bit more help there.
Agreed.
But I kind of in like your camp here. I don't totally dislike this at all. I think it's a sneaky good fit. It's not where I thought he was going to go, but it was
Yeah.
also one of the first and only spots that I heard he was looking at.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I think if they do go out and get someone else that is a little bit more long distance focused who can score points on the track but can also help them in cross country, I think that this makes a lot more sense where they can kind of build out a team that is at least close to being on the national stage in cross country, and then that's where I feel like get a lot more value out of Kipiego. It'll be interesting to see what he can do during this indoor season. He hasn't really done anything on that level yet, but I think his ability to grow and the time that he does have to grow over the next few years could turn him into a really a 3 season athlete that is very valuable, scoring points across all those seasons. So, I mean, again, we thought he was one of the most valuable transfer targets in the entire NCAA, and for Texas A&M to get him is a huge win for them. I mean, just thinking about all the other teams that I'm sure were super, super interested.
Yeah, so pretty much everyone.
Yeah.
But regardless, let's move over to. I don't want to say this surprised me, but maybe it caught me off guard is the right wording, and that is Carrie Balaga
Hmm.
from Colorado and Allison Churchill, who usually I'm pretty good about hearing these transfers and grad transfers and who's on the portal, but then Allison Churchill from Florida State to NAU. Had never like heard any kind of
Yeah.
rumors or rumblings about Churchill. Balaga obviously reported she was on the portal and things of that nature. Um, Scale of 1 to 10 surprise factor for each of them, so two different ratings, and then just general thoughts.
For Balaga, I think it's like a 3 or 2. Like this makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
She's going from one distance powerhouse to another. I was surprised that she was leaving in the first place, but if she's going to leave somewhere like Colorado, Northern Arizona makes a lot of sense. So I think this is exactly what you would expect from someone like her. For Churchill, though, a little bit more surprising just because this was not on our radar at all. But from a purely like fit in terms of the type of runner she is, the type of runner that NAU has traditionally gone after, it's really not that big of a surprise either. I would probably go like a 4. I think it'll be interesting to see how much she improves at NAU, because we've seen a lot of other moves, graduate transfers, go to NAU where we're like, we think they'll help, but we don't know how much. And then they turn out to be all Americans and they look great. I mean, there were several examples of that last year. Maybe she can turn into an even better version of herself in Flagstaff and be one of their big drivers to winning their first title on the women's side.
Yeah, it's really interesting this move, just about like their cross country hopes moving forward, because the timelines are really unique with
Yeah.
their current roster and everyone else's roster. Because obviously they lose Larkin, they lose Rice. This is all based on Tiefer's eligibility, by the way.
Yeah.
They return Stearns, they return Smee, they return Upshaw, they return Congdon, and and they do not return Maisie Grice, although I'm pretty sure Kira Moore would probably be in that lineup next year.
Mhm.
So in a way, you're effectively replacing Larkin and Rice, albeit not at that low stick scoring.
Right.
And so you wonder, you're like, okay, well, these are really good runners. Churchill can probably be, you could probably make an argument that she has a shot at least being a top 20 low stick. And in
Hmm.
fact, I think she has a very good shot, considering that she was 22nd at the national meet and she was probably pretty close to that in our into season rankings. But a lot of this comes down to Balaga. How good is Balaga in year 2? She was really solid, even great in year 1. Um, but can she be a true top 40 All American and then some at next year's national meet? And then also, NC State, what do they do? Like, I don't know how confident we are that they'll be national title favorites. Oklahoma State, they'll lose Rowe. Well, and that's obviously a heavy hitter. Notre Dame's going to lose all their top women. Florida loses all theirs. Tennessee is like the only one. I don't know if we're really confident in Tennessee yet to do something like that. And
Yeah.
so usually I'd say these are good additions, but it's not enough. But based on what everyone else is doing, this might just keep them as the national title favorites in cross country for next year.
I think it does. I just you look at even though they are losing some big names, they showed so much depth last year, and so
Mm-hmm.
even if you're trading out 3 for 2, like I still don't think that's fine. And Churchill, like you said, should be an impact scorer right away. And for Balaga, I mean, I don't even think she has to be that much better than she was like this past year. Like, and really, quite frankly, they're not trying to bring her in for what she's going to be able to do next year. They're bringing her in for what she's going to be able to do like in 2 years, in 3 years, when she
Well, I think it is
absolutely
convenient timing.
well, oh no, I mean it's certainly like a nice benefit that she's going to be able to be hopefully a contributor next year. But they're hoping they like with Balaga, they have the next like low stick for their team and like and possibly in what 2025 and 2026. And I
Probably.
think that is probably the most exciting part about getting Balaga and why I think she was someone that was in high demand, someone we had talked about NC State probably was coming after because it just made a lot of sense from a fit perspective. So you pair these two transfers together, and I think they're just the perfect blend of like helping you now and then also helping you later.
Yeah. Even Alison Churchill couldn't stand the ACC, so she had to get down there as well. But it's a joke.
Another Florida State joke.
Yeah, zing. Anyways, okay. Let's wrap it all up. Like I said, it's a holiday podcast. Keep it a little bit shorter this week. And my final, Salan Ayildez. We had reported that she was on the transfer portal. I had told you that she was down to one or two major powers. One of those powers ended up being Oregon. She officially signed earlier this week. She was listed, I think, last week on their Tiefers roster or something along those lines. But she's really, I think, from my understanding, that she's been dead set on Oregon for about a week and a half, 2 weeks prior to all that. I mean, it seemed pretty straightforward. I had heard that Florida was the other team in contention.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, but which also it makes sense. The kind of like that mile cross country focus there. But at the end of the day, Oregon is like just the perfect spot. You said it. I said it. I think on my scale of like surprise factor of like 1 to 10, I think it's like a 2.
One.
Yeah, I'm not surprised in the slightest. She perfectly fits the roster ethos, the identity there. Like I want to analyze this, but I can't. And so instead, what I'll now ask you is this. Do the Oregon women have the deepest group of milers in the NCAA?
Absolutely. Like this is a group that I what I was going to ask is how many women will they have in the final in the like in the mile and in the 1500 meters, because it's not unrealistic that like half the scorers at the NCAA meet are Oregon Ducks. Like
Well, let's also remember that I think there's still some transfer eligibility things that could halt some of this. I know there's some technicalities.
right.
Now the new NCAA ruling with the fall athletes, but how does that impact? So Barnett and Ayildez. But let's just say fast forward a year.
Right.
I think there's a legitimate argument that all four of those women, Elmore, Kazmierska, Barnett, and Ayildez, make the final.
Yeah, I mean, I think they will likely be favorites to do so. Like, I mean, and that's crazy. I mean, we've obviously seen Washington men do something similar, but I think what Oregon has put together on the women's side seems to be rivaling that, and I'm fascinated to see if them all training together is going to push them to even higher heights. Like when three of these women have run 408 or faster in the 1500, like can you get all four under there, and then could you get them under 407 or 406? Like I like how much better can they get? And I think that's kind of the scary part because they're already all very, very good.
Yeah, like I was just quickly glancing through some teams and some names, and like the only teams that I can like really think of being like competitive in terms of deep mile groups are Washington and BYU.
Yeah,
that's about it.
And BYU just doesn't have the same like firepower necessarily that matches. Like they're all very good, but you wouldn't be thinking that they're going to have like more than two in a final. So I mean that's just what sets this Oregon team far apart from everyone else in the NCAA.
And it also makes you wonder about for next fall, like, hey, is Ayildez, because of this? Again, I haven't read too closely into this. I still need to sit down and look at it. But because of that NCAA transfer ruling that they can compete right away in 2024-2025 academic year for fall sports, does that now mean Ayildez can now compete next fall? And that would mean that Barnett can compete next fall. That would mean Victoria Patterson can compete next fall. That would mean, you have Elmore, who's in her prime. Like, you start thinking about this, and if I'm correct, and all of those women are eligible next fall, like I think they are, that is a scary, scary group in a year that should be relatively wide open for the podium.
Yeah.
I would be very, very careful about how good that Oregon team is because that's one of the last teams I would want to face.
I think one of my bold predictions this at the beginning of this year was Oregon would be a podium team or close to it, and maybe I was just a year early on
You're
that
probably a
because
year
yeah,
early.
I absolutely agree. If they have everybody like ready to go, they have one of the deepest and just like and at the same time top heavy rosters when it comes to the grass, and I think they'll be really fun to watch, especially going up against a lot of rosters that are not as potent as they once were.
I agree. And Ben, it's time to go enjoy the holidays. Um, Thank you very much, Ben, for your time and effort today. We're doing it on a Saturday. Or interrupting Steelers football for that. But regardless, appreciate your time and effort. Everyone, hope you have a very happy holiday. If you could, leave us a Christmas or holiday present, that'd be great by going to ratings and reviews, Apple, Spotify. You can sign up, not sign up, you can subscribe on YouTube, but you can sign up for a TSR boost plan. Hey, you think like you need like a last minute Christmas gift? Actually, this is going to come out after Christmas. So, in psych, New Year's gift. I'm sure there's another holiday that I'm just, not ignorant. I'm just ignorant enough to not remember here. So I apologize. But if you do need a last minute gift and you need something there, TSR subscription. So.
Or how about like I didn't get you a good gift, or I forgot to give you a Christmas gift. Here you go. This is the way you make it.
And then you just over delivered. That's really what happens.
Exactly.
But Ben, that's all I got. You good?
All good. Until next time, I'll talk to you.
I'll talk to you.